Through the kitchen window, Mara watches her cousin Brielle shriek with joy as she receives a shiny new Jeep for graduation, paid for with Mara's college fund. The late May sun glinted off the Jeep's hood like it had something to prove. Brielle circled the driveway, tossing her graduation cap in the air, squealing each time the engine purred. Uncle Dave filmed her on his phone, Aunt Laurie dabbed at her eyes with a monogram napkin, and Paul, Mara's father, stood off to the side, arms folded proudly. Sharon, Mara's mother, clapped politely, casting the occasional glance toward the kitchen window where her daughter stood unnoticed. Inside, the scent of lemon bars cooling on the counter mingled with the faint static of a half-tuned radio in the garage. Mara kept her hands busy slicing strawberries for the dessert tray, but her eyes stayed locked on the celebration outside. Each honk of the car horn felt like another nail hammered into a door she didn't even know had closed. She didn't need to hear the explanation again. She'd heard it last night, carefully worded over meatloaf. It's just practical, Paul had said, folding his napkin like a banker balancing a checkbook. Brielle's heading to a competitive program. The Jeep is a necessity. Safety, reliability, presentation. Sharon added, and your scholarship only covers partial tuition. You can work, take out loans, you'll be fine. No one mentioned the years Mara had worked weekends at the library or the birthday checks she'd deposited into the very fund, now buying all-wheel drive and a backup camera. Outside, Brielle called out, Mara, come take a picture with me. Mara smiled automatically, wiped her hands on a kitchen towel, and stepped into the glare. The lawn was peppered with folding chairs, balloons tangled in the branches overhead, and neighbors balancing paper plates of pasta salad. She stood next to Brielle, posed with a hollow smile, and stepped back before anyone noticed the stiffness in her shoulders. By the time the group began singing an off-key rendition of Happy Graduation to You, Mara had quietly slipped away, her feet taking her to the place she always went when she needed the world to make sense. Grandma Evelyn's garage. The space smelled like motor oil and old coffee. Sunlight filtered through dusty windows, catching on jars of screws and wires. Mara sat at the old workbench where a vintage transistor radio lay in pieces. She picked up the soldering iron without thinking, slipping easily into the rhythm of connection, heat, and focus. Her fingers moved with a memory that belonged more to her body than her brain. She didn't hear the door open, didn't notice the soft footfall until a cup of iced tea was set gently beside her elbow. Grandma Evelyn lowered herself onto the stool opposite her, not speaking, just watching. Her presence filled the room with something more solid than comfort, something like gravity. Mara didn't look up. They used my fund. Evelyn didn't respond immediately. She pulled a small cloth from her apron pocket and began wiping off a pair of safety glasses. Finally, she said, Your hands are steadier when you're angry. Mara gave a short, breathless laugh. They said it was practical, that Brielle needs it more. Practical can be a tidy word for something messy, Evelyn said, handing her the glasses. Mara placed them on the bench, staring at the unfinished radio. What if they're right? What if I'm just average? Evelyn leaned forward slightly, her gaze sharp. Average girls don't rewire circuitry with a pencil behind their ear and a split headphone jack in their pocket. Mara didn't reply. The praise felt too generous, too dangerous to believe. Evelyn reached into her cardigan and pulled out a tiny brass key, the kind that might open a drawer or a box of letters. She placed it on the bench and nudged it forward. When the noise gets too loud, try this. Mara picked it up, the cool metal warming quickly in her hand. What's it for? You'll know when it's time. They sat in silence after that, the kind of silence that held more words than conversation ever could. Mara finished reconnecting the radio's battery line, and static filled the garage like gentle rain. Later that evening, after the party had faded and the leftovers had been sealed in plastic wrap, Mara stood outside her bedroom window, the key still tucked in her palm. The glow of the porch light threw long shadows on the sidewalk. She could hear her parents' voices through the vent. Paul was recounting how impressed everyone was with Brielle's poise, Sharon musing that the Jeep made the right impression for someone heading to a top-tier university. She'll land on her feet eventually, Paul said. She's hands-on, not academic. Mara's breath caught. She turned away from the window, closed her hand around the key, and crossed the room. The old jewelry box on her shelf clicked open. She placed the brass key inside and shut it gently, then sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the attic door across the hall. Mara placed the brass key in her jewelry box and stared at the attic door, uncertain and heavy with questions. Each morning, Mara walks past her cousin's idle Jeep and pedals her bike to the hardware store for her summer job. The early June sun hadn't yet burned off the dew when Mara coasted down Oak Street, her old 10-speed bike creaking with each turn of the pedals. The Jeep sat in the driveway like a monument, polished, unmoved, admired, but unused. Brielle had gone on a short trip with friends after graduation, leaving the car behind like a trophy in a glass case. Mara passed it without a glance, focusing on the road ahead, the breeze against her face, the steady rhythm of moving forward. Downtown Colfax stirred slowly in the mornings. The barbershop's striped pole already spun lazily. Ethel's place had its neon open sign flickering, and the scent of cinnamon rolls drifted faintly from the corner bakery. Mara parked her bike beside the hardware store, locked it with a rusted chain, and ducked inside. Mr. Dean, the owner, looked up from behind the counter, peering over his glasses. "Morning, Mara. We got a batch of old transistor radios in that someone once cleaned and checked. Thought of you." Mara smiled, setting her bag down. "Perfect. I brought my own soldering iron today." The back workbench had become her little sanctuary. Customers rarely ventured there, and Mr. Dean let her keep her tools in a drawer marked "Property of Genius." She spent the morning pulling apart faded casings, cleaning corrosion, and testing each component with the kind of focus that made hours evaporate. Around lunchtime, Gus wandered in, his suspenders stretched over a flannel shirt, despite the heat. He carried a thermos of iced coffee and a box of mismatched vacuum tubes. "Heard you were the new queen of frequencies," he said, setting the box on the counter with a thud. "I wouldn't go that far," Mara replied, standing to greet him. Gus leaned against the counter, nodding toward the back room. "You still tinkering in your grandma's attic?" "Every day after work," she said. "It feels safe there." Gus chuckled. "That's where she figured out half her life. People thought she was just playing with junk. Truth is, she was hiding brilliance in plain sight." Mara tilted her head. "You two went way back, huh?" "Signal Corps, Korea. Evelyn wasn't just fixing radios. She was intercepting messages, repairing field units under fire." He sipped his coffee. "She could build a transmitter out of scrap metal and prayer." That night after dinner, Mara climbed up to the attic. The room smelled faintly of solder, old fabric, and something like eucalyptus. She flipped on the lamp, revealing rows of stacked notebooks, labeled circuits, and neatly arranged tools Evelyn had curated over decades. In the corner sat the same transistor radio she'd been working on, now fully functional, though she still turned it on, more for comfort than signal. She set down her bag and opened one of the notebooks. A folded sheet slipped out, an old sketch Evelyn had given her weeks ago. It showed the beginning of a design, a circuit labeled Wevlin Prototype 1, incomplete and scrawled with notes in Evelyn's looping cursive. Next to the drawing, someone had written, "Unfinished, but maybe your hands can finish what mine couldn't." Mara traced the lines with her finger. The design looked like an advanced local broadcasting unit, maybe something Evelyn had dreamed of building, but never got around to finishing. The idea of continuing it made her chest tighten, not with fear, but something closer to responsibility. As the sun dipped behind the trees, she heard a soft knock on the attic frame. Alex, the boy from down the block, peeked in. "My mom said you fix stuff," he said shyly. "My Walkman won't play my grandpa's tapes." Mara smiled and waved him in. "Let's take a look." He settled beside her as she opened the tape player. The gears were jammed with lint, and the rubber band had loosened. Mara explained each step as she worked, and Alex's eyes widened as the parts came apart and returned, good as new. "Whoa," he breathed when the tape clicked into place. "You're like a machine whisperer." "Just patient," she said. "Machines tell you what's wrong if you listen long enough." Alex looked around the attic, taking in the shelves, the radio, the half-finished diagrams. "Your grandma was cool." Yeah, Mara said quietly. She really was. She stayed up late that night, soldering small parts, organizing the materials Evelyn had left behind. She felt less like she was mourning now and more like she was being prepared, guided even. There were pages in those notebooks with titles like Alternate Frequencies and Emergency Pulse Loops, written in both English and code. Around midnight, Mara sat back, flexing her fingers. The key Evelyn had given her weeks ago still lay in the drawer. She turned it over in her hand, but didn't reach for the cabinet just yet. Somehow, she knew that when she finally opened it, she wouldn't be the same girl who watched from the kitchen window that day. The next morning, an ambulance was parked outside Grandma's house. The town gathers for Evelyn's funeral, small, respectful, full of casseroles and folded hymnals. The church pews creaked gently beneath the weight of memory. First Baptist wasn't a large building, but on that warm August morning, it felt full, not just with people, but with something heavier. Familiar faces dotted the room, neighbors who'd known Evelyn since she moved to Colfax in the 60s, retired engineers from Des Moines who came with stories and handshake condolences, kids who once brought their broken toys to her garage and left with both them and their confidence restored. Mara sat in the front row between her parents, hands folded neatly in her lap. Her black dress was too tight at the shoulders and smelled faintly of mothballs. The brass key Evelyn had given her weeks earlier pressed into her palm, hidden in her fist. She hadn't let go of it since the ambulance had pulled away that morning. Gus stood at the podium, his voice rough but steady. Evelyn Jensen wasn't flashy, he said. She didn't care much for titles or attention or whether the world thought she was smart. But I'll tell you what, when your radio's fried in a storm or you need a signal 3 counties over in the middle of a blackout, suddenly the quietest woman in town becomes the one you remember. There were murmurs of agreement, some soft chuckles, and a few sniffles. Brielle arrived halfway through the eulogy in a crisp white sundress, offering no apology for being late. She sat near the back, legs crossed, scrolling occasionally on her phone. After the final hymn, How Great Thou Art, chosen by Mara for its calm, undemanding melody, the congregation filed into the church basement for coffee, punch, and a buffet of casseroles. Mara moved through the room like a shadow, accepting polite pats on the shoulder and murmured condolences, eyes drifting often toward the corner table where Evelyn's photo sat beside a dusty toolkit and a vase of wildflowers. Paul leaned down to whisper, "We should speak with Mr. Tucker. He wants to meet this afternoon." Mara just nodded. Mr. Tucker's office above the insurance agency smelled like old paper and lemon furniture polish. He was a slender man with hair like dandelion fluff and a tie 2 inches too short. He motioned them all inside, Paul and Sharon, Mara, Brielle, and Aunt Lori, and gestured toward a laptop already open on the desk. "Your grandmother left detailed instructions," he said, adjusting his glasses. "We'll begin with a video she recorded 6 months ago." He hit play. Evelyn appeared on the screen, sitting in her attic workshop in a sweater Mara had never seen before. The image was clear, the sound sharp. Her hands were folded in her lap. "My dear family," she began, in a voice firmer and more articulate than Mara had ever heard in public. "If you're seeing this, I've likely passed. I won't say I'm sorry. I lived fully, quietly, and precisely the way I wanted." Mara's breath caught. Even through a screen, Evelyn seemed entirely present. "For those who only knew me as someone who fixed clocks and radios, there's something I'd like you to know. Before I moved to Colfax, I was Lieutenant Evelyn Graves, Signal Corps, and later worked under DARPA on covert tech transmission systems. I left that world not because I had to, but because I wanted to see what kind of woman I could be without a title stitched to my coat." There was a long silence in the room. Sharon's face had gone pale. Paul leaned forward as if trying to find the lie in the pixels. "I kept my work private for reasons you may not understand," Evelyn continued, "but I did so intentionally, so I could see who in my family would rise not through inheritance, but through instinct." She paused, then her eyes turned directly to the camera. "Mara." The room shifted. "You came to my garage when the world overlooked you. You built, fixed, wondered, without asking if it would earn applause. You listened more than you spoke. You noticed what others discarded. That's the kind of mind the world needs. A tear slipped down Mara's cheek. Evelyn's voice softened. To Brielle, I leave $10,000 toward further education, provided she maintains a 3.0 GPA. To Paul and Sharon, $5,000 each. Available only after Mara completes her first degree. Paul began to speak, but Mr. Tucker held up a hand. The remainder of my estate, including intellectual property, assets, and holdings in full, goes to Mara Jensen, not because she's more special, but because she was kind when no one was looking. The video ended. Mr. Tucker cleared his throat. We'll begin paperwork shortly. Brielle sat frozen. Sharon's lips parted, then closed. Paul looked as though he had aged 5 years in the space of that sentence. No one said a word. That night, Mara sat alone in the attic. She held the brass key between her fingers, heart thrumming in her chest. She crossed to the far wall where a small, unassuming cabinet stood beneath a workbench. She knelt, fitted the key into the lock, and turned. The drawer opened with a quiet click. Inside were blueprints, letters, and a sealed envelope addressed simply, "Broadcast this." Mara picked it up with trembling fingers and slid a small blade under the flap. Inside was a note in Evelyn's familiar handwriting. You were never meant to be like them. You were meant to build something they'll never see coming. A week after the funeral, Colfax starts buzzing, not about Evelyn's passing, but about who she left everything to. The murmurs began at the diner. Ethel's place wasn't known for discretion, and the coffee cups clinked louder than usual that morning as regulars leaned closer over their pancakes. By midweek, the news had made its way through the barber shop, the post office, and the church potluck list. It wasn't just that Evelyn Jensen had left behind a sizable estate, it was who she'd given it to. Mara heard her name in whispers before she ever heard it spoken to her face. That quiet Jensen girl, someone muttered as she passed the grocery store entrance. The one who always looked like she was thinking about wires and numbers. In another aisle, didn't even go to prom, and now she's got patents in her name. At home, things were colder than usual. Paul avoided eye contact, stirring his coffee like it owed him money. Sharon stayed upstairs longer in the mornings. Brielle, back from her trip and somehow still sun-kissed, acted as if the Jeep was just a coincidence, like she'd forgotten entirely that the down payment had once been earmarked for someone else's future. One evening, Mara returned from the hardware store to find her parents waiting at the dining table, the room unnaturally quiet. "We want to talk," Sharon began, her voice too smooth. Paul tapped a folder on the table. "It's not about taking anything from you. It's about sharing, family unity." Mara stayed standing. "Evelyn's decision was emotional," Sharon added. "You're young. You don't know how much responsibility that kind of money brings. If we help manage it—" "No," Mara said quietly. "Grandma trusted me. That's all I need." Paul's jaw flexed. "You're being unfair. This was supposed to help the whole family." "It already did," Mara said, turning away. "When you gave my college fund to Brielle." She left the room without another word. In the attic that night, she tried to steady her hands. The blueprints Evelyn had left behind were detailed but unfinished, notes in tight handwriting, circuits sketched over and resketched, equations curling like vines across the page. It wasn't just technology, it was philosophy. The opening diagram was labeled W.F. Lynn Pulsecaster, Prototype 1. The idea was bold, a localized transmitter that could override standard FM bands within a set radius, capable of broadcasting emergency messages, or Evelyn hinted, a signal meant only for those who listen closely. Mara stayed up late, comparing notes, rearranging wires. She traced Evelyn's designs not just for accuracy, but to feel her presence. Each capacitor, every hand-drawn loop, felt like a breadcrumb. By the third day, the hardware shop had offered her a paid after-hours workspace, and Mr. Dean started casually dropping off extra parts that just happened to be exactly what she needed. He never said anything beyond a nod, but his support was clear. The real surprise came when Gus appeared on her porch one afternoon with a heavy metal toolbox. Ethel says you're building something, he said, no preamble. Mara opened the door. I'm trying. Then you'll need these, he grunted, setting the toolbox down with a thud. Belonged to your grandma. She lent 'em to me 30 years ago. Guess she wants 'em back, through you. She didn't know what to say. Gus didn't wait for thanks. He paused on the porch, staring out at the street. People talk. Don't worry about that. They talked about your grandma, too, when she first moved here. Thought she was strange. Kept to herself, never asked for permission. Mara nodded. She didn't need it. That's right. He looked at her, his eyes sharp beneath the brim of his cap. And neither do you. That night, she sat with the sealed envelope Evelyn had left, the one marked Broadcast This. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside, she found two things: a schematic for a modified frequency broadcaster and a handwritten message that simply read, Colfax listens when Colfax feels heard. Give them something worth tuning into. She blinked back a swell of emotion. The diagram was complete. Evelyn had written the last section in faded blue ink. Mara studied the power draw, the antenna specs, the narrowband filter. It was beautiful, bold, achievable. She spent the next few nights building, revising, testing components. Each failure felt like a conversation with Evelyn, each success a silent nod. When she powered up the prototype for the first time, the attic filled with a low hum, steady and calm like a heartbeat. She hadn't told anyone yet, not her parents, not even Gus. But word must have gotten out because 2 days later there was a knock on the front door. She opened it to find Alex and 3 other kids from the neighborhood standing there with wide eyes and hesitant smiles. Ms. Jensen, Gus said you might teach us? The attic is alive again, buzzing with tools, paper blueprints, and the curious voices of Colfax's kids. On the first cool morning of September, Mara propped open the attic windows to let in the crisp breeze. Sunlight spilled across Evelyn's old workbench, now crowded with coils of copper wire, toolboxes, and half-assembled circuit boards. The kids sat cross-legged on the rug, trading jokes between wire spools and resistors, their laughter bubbling like a long-forgotten station breaking through the static. Alex was the most fearless. He had already named their first project Operation Frequency. Jenny, a 5th grader who wore her dad's baseball cap backward, was meticulous and quiet, jotting notes like blueprints. Max and Theo, twin brothers who once got suspended for building a potato battery that shorted a hallway light, were drawn to the soldering iron like moths to a porch bulb. Mara guided them gently, explaining the difference between positive and ground, teaching them to listen for the telltale buzz of a working circuit. She never raised her voice. She never needed to. The attic hummed with a kind of reverence, both for the tools in their hands and the woman whose fingerprints still lingered on every corner of the room. Gus stopped by most afternoons, always pretending he just happened to be in the neighborhood. He'd lean against the doorframe with a mug of coffee, watching silently as Mara adjusted knobs and the kids argued over antenna placement. Sometimes he'd chime in with a story about Evelyn jury-rigging a signal booster out of soup cans in '72, or the time she transmitted a secret wedding proposal through Morse code from a church bell tower. She never stopped experimenting, he told them one day. Even when people said it was pointless, Mara glanced up from the tuning dial. Did they ever believe her? Gus shrugged. Didn't matter. She believed herself. That's what counts. Later that week, Brielle appeared unannounced, standing in the attic doorway like she'd walked into the wrong room and didn't quite know how to leave. Her hair was curled, her phone in one hand. She looked at the kids, then at Mara, then at the old transmitter on the desk. You're really doing this? She asked. Mara didn't stop soldering. Looks like it. Brielle lingered. So are you going to be like a teacher now? Or is this just your hobby with the inheritance? Mara met her gaze for a moment. It's not about the money, Brielle. Brielle hesitated. Then what is it? It's about the signal, Mara said. What we send into the world, and what we hope comes back. Brielle didn't reply. She left as quietly as she'd arrived. By the end of the month, the prototype was nearly complete. The kids helped build a small broadcast tower from old metal tent poles, and mounted it discreetly through the attic window. Mara calibrated the frequency using Evelyn's diagrams and her own careful notes, testing the range in concentric loops across town. Each time they flipped the switch, a subtle warmth filled the room, as if Evelyn herself were nodding from the shadows. Alex was the one who connected the final wire. His fingers trembled slightly, but his smile was solid. The unit buzzed to life, the red light blinking steadily. "It's ready," Mara said, barely above a whisper. The kids looked at one another. "What do we play?" Max asked. Mara pulled out a dusty cassette labeled in Evelyn's handwriting. "Test Signal 3 Safe Band." She slid it into the deck. A soft static filled the attic for a beat, then a voice, clear and steady, emerged. Evelyn's voice. "If you're hearing this, you found something real. Not flashy, not loud, but real. You're listening with more than your ears, and I promise you're not alone." The kid sat frozen, wide-eyed. Alex mouthed, "Was that her?" Mara nodded, her throat tight. That night, after the kids had gone and the attic had returned to stillness, Mara sat by the transmitter and stared out the window. Porch lights blinked on across Colfax, a quiet constellation. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Wind rustled dry leaves on the sidewalk. She pressed the mic button and leaned close. "This is Wevlin. Some signals don't fade. Mr. Tucker calls. Thanksgiving's coming. You may want to think bigger." On Thanksgiving morning, Colfax wakes to pumpkin pie, parade reruns, and a quiet buzz on an unexpected frequency. The air was crisp, the kind that carried the scent of chimney smoke and cinnamon from house to house. Sidewalks gleamed faintly with frost, and windows all over town glowed with the gentle flickering warmth of ovens in overdrive. In one house, a grandfather basted a turkey with military precision. In another, kids argued over whether cranberry sauce should come from a can or a cousin's hand. And in the attic above the Jensen home, Mara checked the dials one last time. The transmitter hummed softly, a living thing now, steady and sure. Gus sat nearby, sipping hot coffee from a thermos that had seen 3 decades of use. "You ready?" he asked, voice low and kind. Mara looked over at the 4 kids seated in a row, like tiny broadcast interns. Alex had his lucky screwdriver tucked behind his ear. Jenny clutched her project notes. The twins wore matching Signal Squad t-shirts they'd made with markers and old undershirts. She adjusted the mic, voice calm. "We go live in 3, 2. The broadcast began. From homes, cars, and pocket radios around town, Evelyn's signal slipped into being, not with fanfare, but with quiet presence. First came the voice of young Theo, sharing a story about fixing the old church bell with a rubber band and duct tape. Then Jenny read a poem she'd written about radios and remembering. The twins took turns telling signal jokes, grown-worthy puns that still made their parents laugh. And finally, Alex introduced a special guest with all the seriousness his 9-year-old self could muster. "Next," he said into the mic, "we have a message from someone who started all this, even if she didn't mean to." Mara took the mic. "Good morning, Colfax. If you're tuning in, welcome to WEVLYN. This is a signal born from scrap and kindness, from the hands of a woman who taught us how to listen before we speak. Today, as we pass dishes and memories across tables, I hope you hear not just our voices, but what's behind them: connection, care, and a little static of wonder." At the church basement, where families gathered for the town's potluck-style Thanksgiving meal, Mr. Tucker discreetly turned up a portable radio. Conversation slowed as people noticed the familiar, gentle voice filling the room. Even the older folks, usually skeptical of those newfangled projects, leaned in. At a corner table, Paul and Sharon listened in silence. For the first time in months, Paul didn't fidget or speak. Sharon blinked quickly, dabbing at her eyes with a folded napkin. "You think she wrote that herself?" Sharon whispered. Paul nodded slowly. "She's got Evelyn's way with words." At that same moment, a boy named Caleb, visiting from out of town, turned to Alex and said, "Can anyone join?" Alex looked over at Mara. "She wants to learn too," he added. Mara smiled. "We'll find room." Outside, snowflakes began to drift lazily from the sky, light at first, then steady, powdering the sidewalk, softening the rooftops. Colfax quieted under it, a hush of first snow and full bellies, the kind of stillness that holds meaning. The signal continued. Evelyn's voice returned, a pre-recorded message saved for this moment, warm and steady. If you're hearing this, you're part of something better now. Mara looks out the attic window, snow beginning to fall. Guess it's time for the next signal. On a quiet Thanksgiving morning, a girl's voice reached across a small town, not demanding attention but inviting it. It wasn't the volume of the broadcast that mattered, but the care behind each word, each signal passed hand to hand, heart to heart. Sometimes the ones we overlook carry the clearest message, and kindness, offered without expectation, often finds its way back through the least expected frequency. So the next time you hear static in the air or see someone standing alone, remember, goodness rarely announces itself, but it always arrives just in time.